Okay, welcome back everyone to our final guest speaker session of the conference. I can't believe how many great speaker sessions we've had over the past 2 days, and I know this one's going to be just as fantastic. So I'm really looking forward to it. And with me here on stage, I have Angela Ramos. Angela is the Associate Director of English Language Programs and Senior Oral Communication Specialist at Brandeis University in Massachusetts. She is also a returned Peace Corps volunteer, and she has taught English to speakers of other languages in Ecuador, China, Costa Rica, and the United States. So welcome, Angela. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and we can get started.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Lise. And I would like to thank the entire team for this amazing conference that we've all been able to enjoy over the last few days. I've been able to attend some of the sessions and have just enjoyed hearing all of these great perspectives. And I really appreciate having space for this timely topic. So, my hope is that during today's session, we will be able to articulate 5 key differences between AI and human beings and why this is worth defining, right? All of us have kind of this sense of what everything is, but sometimes to be able to name something gives us a better chance of utilizing it correctly. Then we'll talk about 7 strategies for meaningful conversation, and finally have a chance to meet with one another to discuss the importance of educators and educational spaces in promoting balance in the age of AI. So I'd like to start with a poll. And in this poll, I want to note that you can select all that apply. If this is your first time using AirMeet, I encourage you to make sure you scroll down to select all of the contexts in which you work. So Lise, could I trouble you to share the poll, please?
Angela, we've got the poll up there, but we can't see your screen. So just in a second, let's let the poll stay on the screen. And then afterwards, I'll make sure that you're sharing your presentation properly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Also, please note that if you're interested in seeing the response to the poll, you'll have to answer the poll question yourself. Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, from the results that we can all see at the moment, it looks like about half of us are in community education and higher ed, some in teacher education, and others in early childhood and secondary school. This is helpful for me because as we move through our session today, I want to make sure that I'm tailoring my examples to those that will best match all of your teaching contexts. And another reason that we wanted to do this poll right at the beginning is because later in our session, we'll have a poll that more closely relates to our session content. And when using new technology or new platforms, I always like to have a chance to rehearse it or to try it out with my students in kind of a low stakes way first. So, Lise, thanks so much for sharing the poll. I'm going to take another crack at sharing my screen. So, there's screen 1, share. Is everyone able to see that now?
Yep, I can see your full screen, but I'm not seeing the presentation. There we
All
go.
right. How about now?
In presentation mode. Perfect. That looks great. Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So, as I mentioned, our objectives are articulating key differences, naming 7 strategies for meaningful conversation, and discussing the importance of educators and educational spaces in promoting balance in the age of AI. So, a couple of notes before we dive into our content are that you can enlarge the slides by hovering over the top, the top right of your screen and clicking on the 4 little arrows. The main session will be recorded, but the breakout session will not. And finally, if you have questions as we go through the content, please use the Q&A box for questions, which is just at the top left side of your chat. And if you see another question that someone has already asked that you're also interested in the answer to, please use the little up arrow for an upvote. And hopefully we'll be able to see where the greatest interest is when we get to the Q&A section at the end. So let's talk about a few key differences between human beings and AI. Again, all of us have this kind of general sense, but some of the fear, I think, that came at the beginning of this was this kind of nebulous sense of, well, what am I as a human good for when AI is so efficient in so many ways? Well, being able to understand these differences and think about the ways that humanity is unique and is special and is irreplaceable can really help us to make sure that we're focusing on promoting those things and using AI as a tool for humanity as opposed to something that is in competition with humanity. So, like anything else, there are risks, there are benefits, and like any technology, even our cell phones, we can use it for a great deal of convenience, but we don't want it to interfere in our relationships with the people around us, with the human beings who make up our lives. So, I thought, since this is something about AI, I'm going to just ask ChatGPT. And I gave it the prompt, please list the 10 most significant differences between human beings and AI. And of course, it started to generate its response. But a couple of things that I like to do when I'm using this kind of technology are to kind of demonstrate digital literacy. So I always mention this to students too. If I give an assignment that incorporates this, I always include ways for them to protect themselves. So if you take a look, for some of you may be very familiar with ChatGPT, and I know over the last few days we've seen a lot of different generative AI technologies, but I think of this as kind of like the gateway AI. So if you're brand new to it, this is something where you can just feed it a text prompt and it will, generate text in response. But if you circle these three little dots down here at the bottom, or if you click on that, it'll bring you to settings. And then you go down to data controls, and you should toggle this little guy over so that it is deselected. And that will turn your chat history off for your browser. And why do I recommend this? Some of you may be familiar with the term, there's no such thing as a free lunch, or the phrase. And to kind of update that to the digital age, I've heard it said that if the product is free, then you are the product. So there are a lot of apps that we use, and in fact, they're gathering our personal information. And I know that people are joining us from all around the world, and each place has its own privacy laws. But even where these laws are advanced, they still haven't really caught up to technology because there's just so much out there. So, one way that we can protect ourselves and our students, even while we use these tools, is by knowing what's happening in our context and taking advantage of the options that we have to turn off some of the tracking and protect some of our data. I do want to mention that the European data protection regulation is a lot further along on privacy laws than what we have in most of the U.S. Although some states like California do have some additional specificity. But it's a great practice to just look into what the privacy laws are in your area to better understand how your data is being used. And another reason that it's worth thinking about this is that the Center for AI Safety, as some of the Ellii team mentioned this morning, has kind of, they've been in the news a lot lately for submitting this kind of statement that mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority, along with others, of course. But this is something that people are really concerned about. So I can't overstate the importance of using these tools intentionally and carefully. So, in addition to some of the things that AI spit out, we have some of these main ideas of ways that we are distinct as human beings. And again, we know all of this, right? These are all things that like we could have listed if we'd sat out and like listed them all. But we never want to think of humanity as a deficit mindset. Sometimes we get this kind of technology hype where we think this is such an amazing transformative thing. And in many ways it is. I mean, it's a great democratizer of information in that it can make text or video a lot more accessible to people like our language learners. But we also want to be thinking about the ways that we are distinct so we can continue to meet our students' needs and to cherish the things that are unique about humanity, like creativity and imagination, moral and ethical judgment, social intelligence, and also thinking about, you know, not AI versus humanity, but how AI and humanity act in tandem. Because, of course, all of these systems incorporate the biases of their human creators or directors or the people who program them. So, to think of a search engine or something that AI generates as being completely objective and harmless is not necessarily the correct approach. In fact, we need to be really analytical and thoughtful about how much we trust the performance of these tools. So now that we've taken just a really brief look at some of these quick distinctions, I'd like to move into the main topic, which is 7 strategies for meaningful communication. So first, let's take a look at these images. And we'll think to ourselves, or you can pop the answer into the chat, what do these contexts have in common? Community events, and this can be something like bingo, or just talking to a child's teacher, meeting up with friends, running into someone in the supermarket. Networking, which may be a little bit more of an intentional space for small talk, and then educational spaces. So, some of the things that these all have in common include our ability to interact with one another, to gain new perspectives, and to build human relationships and connections. And some of the things that they can help us achieve, besides what I just mentioned and what you all are putting into the chat, are first, we demonstrate our humanity. And just by the way, I thought this was kind of a cool fact. When you have to do this reCAPTCHA and check the box, it's not that a robot is unable to check the box. It's actually that it's sort of tracking how erratic your mouse movement is. So if it's a nice fluid movement, or you tap it on your mobile device and there's nothing to indicate that you're actually a human being by virtue of your unpredictability, then you may have to identify, like, find all the squares with motorcycles and whatnot. But I think that this is such a great kind of extrapolation of the human condition in general. We are not always as predictable or as efficient or as concise as AI, but sometimes that inefficiency is where the exciting moments in our life happen, right? So taking a different road home, going the scenic route, having an unexpected encounter, this is what makes it exciting. And in the context of conversation, it's about those unpredictable moments. When you find somebody with whom you connect, when you're able to kind of capture a new idea or gain a new perspective, these are things that we don't set out to do. So that degree of intentionality that exists when we engage with AI for a specific purpose, it's a totally different situation when we engage with others. It can help our students set themselves apart, of course, whenever we're thinking about something that is maybe a little more transactional in nature, like trying to get a job. And then finally, it builds our human network, right? We never know which person is going to be our new best friend, or the love of our life, or someone who has a connection for us in the future, or someone who just shares a piece of wisdom. It could be someone you run into for 10 minutes of your life, but every single connection that we build is part of our human experience. And so, in today's session, I really want to share 10 ways that we can make the most of every conversation and help our students, both in terms of strategy and in terms of language, to really leverage all of these tools. As I go through, I'm going to talk about a couple of tools for each portion, kind of chronologically, of a conversation. So, first, getting the conversation started. Then, once we're in, keeping it going. And finally, leaving the conversation in a way that feels natural and graceful. So, first, getting the conversation started. I always recommend that my students, in addition to their fundamental information and what's expected, offer something that others can build on. So, for example, my name's Angela Tribus Ramos. I work at Brandeis University, just outside of Boston. And so, some people may have visited Boston or have something to say about Boston. I might say, we're expecting some pretty severe weather later. Hope everyone who's in this area gets home okay. Just something to build on, because if you give only your perfunctory information, people have nothing to grab at. But you want to share something others can build on, even if it's something as simple as, oh, my colleagues and I just arrived last night. It can be something simple. You don't have to really break a lot of your personal boundaries, although, of course, if you're able to be vulnerable and authentic, that's helpful. But giving a little something that people can build on is a way of kind of offering something that can help to get the conversation going. And then we always want to have a few relevant open-ended questions ready to go. This is helpful even if you're operating in your native language, but if you are operating as a learner of an additional language, even if you feel like you know all the pieces, it can be really difficult. We know about the affective filter, right? And how difficult it can be to overcome nerves and a sense of shame about making a mistake. And so one thing that I like to encourage my students to do is to think about the context in which they're going to use these tools, and then to memorize one or two things really, really well. So even in their sleep, they know how to say, what are you finding energizing these days? Or have you ever attended this advice before, or this event before? Do you have any advice? Um, and here's another place where we can kind of use a generative tool to help our students. So let's say that they're looking for something more informational. What advice would you give to someone starting in your field? Um, let's say, for example, that I have a student who is a master's candidate in business analytics. I might say, what questions should I, as this kind of candidate, ask at a job fair? Now, this goes on and on forever. This is a really lengthy response. So for my English language learner who's looking for a really quick list of questions, this is not going to be a useful tool. but I can give it an additional prompt. Please simplify to 10 points. Or please adapt specifically for data risk assessment roles. So we can see, this does kind of start to adapt what tools do you use for risk data assessment, et cetera. And again, this is not the final list. This should be to kind of get our students thinking. And if they say, I really want to follow your advice and prepare my specific language and rehearse and be ready for all of the demands of this social context, I don't know where to start. I feel like I know all these things, but the second I try to think of them, they just escape out of my mind. I think this happens to all of us. So using this kind of tool is a great starting point or a way to kind of kick it off or see some of the phrases that they might try to use or some of the potential directions that a conversation can go. Again, we want to make sure that we're using this wisely, right? I had a student who brought me her resume and her job description, and we talked about the importance of mirroring some of the critical terms. And she said, oh, maybe I'll just feed it into AI and see if it can create an integration. And I said, I mean, you could try that just to see what happens, experiment a little bit. But one thing that that's going to do is it's going to cheat you out of the opportunity to kind of gain mastery of the terms that you need for this particular job. So even though it may help you or has the potential to help you in your writing, it's going to ultimately be a disservice when it comes to your job interview when you need to be able to speak about those things and have a higher degree of automaticity when retrieving those critical key terms. So I mean, it's helpful to have these kinds of conversations with your students. I know that some of us are in contexts where that kind of level of engagement with every student may not be possible. But I think it's wise. I think it's human to acknowledge the limits of our own knowledge and to say, this is something I'm still working on. Why don't you try it out? Think analytically about it. Is this something that's going to be beneficial? How is that different from this previous iteration that you didn't use generative AI for? Different institutions right now have different policies, and I think it's something that a lot are exploring. But ultimately, a great way to just kind of prepare people in general is to acknowledge that we're all kind of growing and looking at it together, and to really make sure that there is a space for reflection on how these are being used. Anyway, though, the takeaway is that we do want to make sure that there are a few relevant open-ended questions ready to go. And this doesn't mean memorize the whole list. It's nice to have some things to pick from, but if you are going into a job fair as someone who is an intermediate speaker of English and you are panicked because you need a job desperately for your visa status or whatever, knowing that you have this one little solid piece of language that you can hold on to, this chunk, this lexical chunk, is really reassuring. So then, one other thing I want to mention here is one of the ways, obviously, that we are distinct from AI is that we have physical bodies, right? And the way that we utilize our bodies in conversation really matters in terms of making people feel connected, making people feel included. So, something I like to do with my students is talk about your role depending on your position. So, if you're on the outside giving these tips, of course, look at the intensity or how personal the group appears, look for a physical gap, stand nearby and make eye contact. Again, you can adapt this for your own context because this will look different in each setting. But where it's appropriate, make eye contact. After you've been acknowledged, join the conversation, being aware of personal space. Again, this is an opportunity for English language teachers to address some, cross-cultural competencies. And then listen to the conversation and find a way to contribute. Don't dominate. And especially for people who are trying to prove their worth, this is a kind of common error. It's to kind of dive in without having listened first. And we think of conversation. We teach a lot of speaking skills, and we need to make sure that we're also focusing really heavily on listening skills. And then there's this huge relief, right? Once we get in, if any of you have ever been in a really awkward small talk context, you know that this is the case. Once we get in, we're so relieved that we kind of forget about the people who haven't made it yet. But I always tell my students too, people people hire people, not resumes, and so they'll remember how you made them feel. They'll remember the way that you treated others around you. And so helping others join the group, making eye contact, moving over to allow space for them to join, and then during a lull in the conversation, introducing yourself and others to a new person. Now, we may think of this as being really common sense, but until we have a chance to rehearse this, I mean, communication is a skill just like any other. So if we're trying to help our students build these conversational skills, I know many people use kind of like the cocktail party activity, and there's this great kind of, kinesthetic tactile dynamic. But we also want to make sure that we say, if you see someone who is not engaged, engage them. Don't make sure that every voice is heard, that we're making space for everyone. All right, so now we're into the conversation. We have offered our building blocks. We've had our planned way to get the conversation started. Now, how do we keep it moving in a way that is useful? One dynamic that I want to mention is the shift versus support response. So we know all about our own lives, right? And it's kind of natural for us to speak about our experience, but we want to really avoid being conversational narcissists. And one way we can do this is by being mindful of the shift versus support response dynamic. So let's say that someone says, "I'm so tired." I'm sure that we've all heard this in education. It's really common for people to take on a lot of different responsibilities. So whether you're hearing it from your colleagues or your students, I'm sure everyone's heard this at least once. Now, of course, it's kind of normal as human beings to be like, "Oh, yeah, I share your experience." And sometimes that's all someone wants, is to feel like they're not alone in what they're experiencing. But we don't really gain a lot of additional information from that approach, from this shift response, where I'm shifting from the original speaker to the listener. Whereas a support response digs a little deeper. It asks for additional information. So if someone says, "I'm so tired," "Oh, really? What's going on?" They might say, "Oh, I've had a lot of work going on. I was attending ElliiCon and it was amazing. I stayed up all night reflecting and writing it down." Or, "My 4-year-old couldn't sleep," or whatever. And so then you really get to know a little more about the person's experience, their context, and you start to dig deeper in. So I'm not saying that we need to do support responses all the time. Of course, there is definitely a time and a place for each one. But sometimes in our eagerness to connect and say, "Oh, yes, I share this experience," we sort of, it's kind of like you're playing with the ball and then, somebody's playing with the ball and you take it from them rather than like letting them continue to play and observing what's happening. You want to kind of figure out when it's appropriate to do this. So when we think about how to do this with our students, of course, a huge part of this is working on not only the grammar of question formation, but also just the skill of knowing, I need to find out more, I need to ask more, and to get into the habit of asking questions. There's not enough energy, there's not enough time in the day to ask a question about everything, but getting into the habit can be really transformative in how people go through their lives. So I can't overstate the importance of building this skill in our students, whether we're building it in a kind of a native language speaking classroom or we're building it in a language learning classroom in any context. So, as a reminder, the shift response uh, moves it away from the original speaker, and the support response keeps it on the speaker. So, we're going to do another poll. And as I mentioned earlier, you're allowed to select more than one option. So, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share so that the second poll can be launched. And in this poll, what you're going to do is you are going to choose the support responses. Okay. These are the responses that keep the focus on the speaker. And make sure that you're remembering that support doesn't mean supportive. It can, but not necessarily, because sometimes we can be supportive without it being a support response. So we're choosing the support responses. And remember, just one more reminder that if you can't see the results of the poll, it may be because you have not yet answered it. Okay, so I see the numbers are starting to stabilize a little bit, and um, most of you are correct. So why? What happened? Absolutely a support response. We're digging for more information. Mine wasn't great either. This is commiserating, certainly, and it's kind of like, "Oh, we're sharing this experience. Yeah, that was really hard." But it does kind of take it from the speaker to the listener, and so that would be actually a shift response. This third one is tricky. "Don't worry, I thought you did an awesome job." Very supportive. This is like super nice, and this is your best friend in the class who's telling you, "Oh, don't worry, it was fine. It went better than you thought." While this is really nice to hear, and while it is a supportive thing to say, it's not a support response because this doesn't really create space to learn anything more. Okay. And on top of that, even if we did think they did well, who are we to say that they can't do better? Instead of saying, I mean, we can have a combination. We can say, "I thought you did an awesome job. What do you think went poorly? What are you feeling unsure about?" Then it's a little bit of a combination because we're reassuring them, but also creating space for them to talk about their own feelings on the topic. Is there something you might do differently next time? certainly a support response and probably the most useful. Again, we're not going to do this every single time because sometimes we're not solution oriented about it, right? We just want to move on with our day. We're like, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to think about it. But there's a lot of benefit to reflecting. If any of you popped into the Teacher Think Aloud podcast, I was in with them this morning, and one of the speakers reminded me of the quote about how, I'm misremembering the exact quote, if you wouldn't mind popping it in the chat, but it's basically that experience doesn't change us, it's reflecting on that experience. And that's Dewey from, I want to say the book is called How to Teach 1910, but John Dewey is the person to whom it should be attributed. Anyway, reflecting is important, right? This is where we find meaning in our experience. Of course, living through it gives us some insight, but taking time to reflect and creating time for our students or our friends or our colleagues or our family to reflect is also really constructive, which is another reason why this support response model can be really beneficial for building meaningful conversation. And the last one, too bad for you, mine was excellent. Yep, nobody thought that was a support response. You are all correct. That's a pretty terrible shift response and is likely to make you an enemy. Okay, so thanks for answering that poll. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. And please bear with me as I get to our section. There we go. So again, the takeaway here is just be mindful of the shift support balance. We can figure out which one we should use based on the needs of the people that we're speaking to, but I really encourage you in your own conversations, even just as you're starting to kind of think about this topic, if somebody says something and your first reaction is to say, that happened to me too, or I also am experiencing this, think, is there another question I can ask that person to gain better insight into their day or to deepen my relationship with them? Just something to think about. We also want to employ active listening and questioning techniques. So, of course, we can work on all of these things with our students, being attentive, asking open ended questions and probing questions, requesting clarification, paraphrasing, being attuned to and reflecting feelings, which is a huge way that we're distinct from AI. And then finally, summarizing, creating spaces for us to be able to kind of work on these skills in our classrooms can help our students to have better conversations, not only because they're speaking and communicating the things that they want to, but also able to get information and gain new perspectives. So I do want to mention just a couple of additional reasons why they help our students. Asking questions lets them gather information, develop logic, promote creativity, and create comparisons and analogies. Also to understand relationships. And it's not just relationships between information, but also relationships between people and biases. And if you're struggling with how to train your students on this, there's a resource that I love from the Global Digital Citizen Foundation. It's called the Ultimate Cheat Sheet for Critical Thinking. And again, if you use the little arrows on your screen, you may be able to make this bigger, but I definitely encourage you to take a closer look at it to get a sense of how we can teach our students to ask questions that really are probing and can inform them about issues of social justice and open their eyes to things that may not immediately be apparent. And so things like, why are people influenced by this? Whose voices are missing? Who deserves recognition for this? Just really training our students not only in the concept of analytical questioning, but also in the language, in structures and stems that they can use as they investigate. Helps them to forecast and prioritize. So ultimately, employing active listening and question techniques is yet another way to keep a conversation going and making it substantive or making it meaningful. So since we are here with Ellii, I wanted to just point out a few great resources for some of the tips that I've mentioned so far. So if you go to the Ellii page and then you use the drop-down material from the drop-down menu from materials and then lessons, you'll see that there's a kind of news section. So that's news to me is one that I chose. And they also have it in different levels, right? So here there's no paid family leave for US women at low, intermediate, and advanced. And as you go into these, you can see some different tasks on the task list. So a couple that I really like for practicing open-ended questions or engaging in discussion are, the discussion or writing or personal response sections. So here you can see a couple of examples are who's the most famous artist from your country of origin? What subjects do they depict? Do you think it's an artist's responsibility to criticize society? Okay, and this this is a complex answer, right? This is something that they're going to need to think about. And if you ask some kind of generative AI, it's going to be able to consolidate a lot of people's opinions on this and to present various views, but it's not going to have formed its own based on its lived experience in your students' context, in their life, in their community. And so, this I think is a great tool from Ellii, and there are a couple of others. I'll direct your attention to also under materials and lessons, these discussions and debates or mini debates. There discussion starters and mini debates. There are so many options. So I really encourage you, if you're struggling to think, how can I structure a comprehensive lesson that ends with a really meaningful application with open questions, to engage my students and get them into the practice of asking these questions? Here are a couple of great places to do that. All right, so we're going to do a little breakout session to give you a chance to kind of think about some of what we've done before we move to our final tips. We'll just take about 5 minutes, and because we're human beings, I want to acknowledge that. We'll take a minute to think and plan. So while you're being moved into the breakout sessions, I encourage you just to take a pen or, think to yourself about the response to these two questions. Which elements of humanity do you most deeply cherish? Which is a big one, right? Which elements of humanity do you most deeply cherish? When do you feel alive? When do you feel invigorated or connected? And how best can you protect these elements as AI advances? Okay, so your conversations in your breakout rooms will not be recorded. There's a timer on the top right of your breakout session, but we hope that you enjoy this chance to connect with one another for just a moment and think about elements of humanity that you cherish and how you can protect them. So I'll stop sharing my screen, take a moment to think, elements you cherish, and how to protect them. And you'll be moved into breakout rooms in just a moment. Okay, just wanted to give a few minutes for everyone to get back from the breakout rooms. If you were pulled away right in the middle of a conversation with your colleagues, I'm sorry to have interrupted you, but we're glad that you had a chance to at least connect with each other for a moment. Um, so now that we've talked about getting the conversation started and keeping it going, we're going into the final set of tips, leaving the conversation. So if you think about, and a metaphor or analogy, if you're driving and then you suddenly slam on the brakes, it's uncomfortable for you, the driver, for your passengers, for everyone around you. In contrast, if you start to kind of slow to a stop, then it's a little bit more comfortable. And one of the ways that we can perform this function in conversation is to get our students used to using pre-closing remarks. So they might try something like summarizing a key thought. So something like, wow, it sounds like you've had a really fulfilling experience at this company. Or address any pending questions like, I actually have to run to class in a few minutes, but before I go, I have one last question about this. And something that I often encourage my students to do as well is to kind of acknowledge other people's time and energy and the demands on their attention by asking, how much time do you have for this conversation? Or finding ways to acknowledge that they are investing something in that conversation with you if you're in a networking setting. Of course, in a more personal or class setting, you won't have to exactly define those parameters, but in any case, indicating that the end is coming can make it feel more comfortable and signal and get our students used to using these kind of oral signposts to let others know what their expectations are of the conversation. So there you have takeaway tip number 5. Use oral signposting to signal impending departure or conclusion of the conversation. And finally, we always want to have a graceful exit strategy and acknowledge the value of the conversation. So for all of us, even just in our daily lives, how good does it feel when someone says, it was so nice to see you, or this meant so much to me? It means a lot to know that we are loved and valued and cherished. And we can do this for our students, not always giving feedback that is around accomplishment. Sometimes it's appreciating them. I'm so happy to see you today. It makes such a difference when you're here. Or I really appreciated your attitude towards this. So thinking about the ways that we engage with people and how we acknowledge their value in a way that is not only transactional, in a way that really tells them why we cherish them as fellow beings on our journey. So a couple of ways that we can do this, we can give our students some stems. Of course, if we're working, I know that a small percentage of our audience today is working with early childhood or with primary school students. And of course, these abilities start from a really young age, and it's so transformative to have people who understand how to be kind to the people around them. So even if we are working with really little ones, just getting them into the habit of saying, I'm so happy to see you today, or modeling kindness. This is something that really makes a difference as they grow. And it matters to all of us, right? No matter what age we are, we like to feel valued. So some sentence starters or some kind of phrase banks that you can share with your students are things like, I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time. Or this has been great or so helpful. May I contact you in the future? Or thanks so much for your insight. I look forward to continuing our conversation soon. And again, to acknowledge kind of time, I see that others are eager to speak with you, so I won't take up any more of your time today, but I'd love to stay in touch. Or I really appreciate hearing your perspective. I'll give that some thought, and then actually giving it thought, right? So AI doesn't care, right? AI is generating things that are based on what it finds, but it probably, I mean, there's a debate, but AI doesn't feel about things the way that humans feel about things. And sometimes for us, we can be resistant to new information, but teaching our students to kind of normalize integrating new information in and like saying, I need to think about that some more. That's a new perspective. I hadn't considered it and I'd like to sit with it for a little while. Our knee-jerk reaction sometimes can be like, nope, I'm right. This new thing is not correct because it doesn't conform to our confirmation bias, but instead giving language that models not only the language we should be using, but also the attitude that we should be demonstrating to have a healthier and more robust society is things like, I'll give that some thought, and then really doing it. A couple of ways to sort of transition. Again, AI doesn't really care who makes the handoff, but human beings don't like to be abandoned. If you're at a social event and you found your one friend and then your one friend goes, you have this like, you're bereft, right? It's the sense of, oh dear, what do I do now? And you like go to find the snacks or try to make a new friend. It's awkward. So, one way that we can sort of ease that transition is saying, can I introduce you to this person? I'll leave you two to talk or get acquainted. And if natural, reference any small talk blocks that have been collected. So, if somebody mentions, oh, the weather's getting colder, I hope I can get a few more games of tennis in. Whenever you conclude, you might say something like, oh, I hope you can get a few games of tennis in soon before the weather changes. Obviously, we don't want it to come across as like artificial or manufactured, but sometimes it's not the things that are relevant that make someone stand apart. It's like, oh, this person was really listening when I expressed my interest. They care about this. And so it may seem like a small thing, but teaching our students not only to like listen and understand, but also to retain information that's important. I mean, this kind of discernment is important at every level, from making meaning to note taking strategies to being able to like effectively use all the information at your disposal to achieve your objective. This is a skill that's good for everything. All right, so let's do a little quiz. I've shared 6 takeaway tips of the 7 so far. So I would like for you to just drop the answer into the chat. You can feel free to just do the number and then the word that's missing. So the first one, share something you can what? Share something that you can build on. Yes. Have a few open-ended what? Ready to go. Questions. Yes. Be mindful of the shift, support, balance. So this is the I'm tired, me too versus oh really, what's going on? Employ what kind of listening techniques and questioning techniques? Active and supportive, of course. We want to be kind, but really active listening. And you can think about that circle of 7. Also, if you want any of my materials, I know that Ellii is posting them. I'm also going to share my contact information, and you're welcome to ask me for it. And I'm happy to share all of these slides along with my references and some recommendations for additional places to get resources. Use what? Oral signposting to signal impending departure or conclusion, just to kind of ease us out of the conversation. And finally, acknowledge what? Acknowledge value. That's right. Or the person. I see someone also contributed. Yeah. We want to acknowledge value. We want to acknowledge the person. We want to acknowledge the people that we engaged with. So before we move to our last section, I want to add this last tip is just be authentic, right? Sometimes we feel this pressure to conform to a particular set of expectations. But ultimately, the way that we create, the way that we engage, the way that we love one another and treat each other with kindness and act in service, all of these things are uniquely human. So, my hope is that we can certainly leverage AI tools, but that we can always, always cherish our humanity and make sure that we are teaching our students to do the same. So, as educators, we're uniquely positioned to teach students how to ask questions and why it's important to do so and how to respond thoughtfully and respectfully. And we're positioned to prepare students to take active roles in society, which includes making informed choices about their use of AI, just like any other technology, and creating spaces for connection and reflection. Okay, so as AI may eventually reduce some of the burden of our tasks or make things a little easier for our students, this may create new opportunities for us to connect with one another better. So we need to be really, really mindful of how we use these new tools and how we cultivate our space. So thank you so much for joining us today. We do have a Q&A in just a moment, but after that, there's a meet and mingle, a wrap up. I want to encourage you to complete Ellie's post-event survey because, of course, we like to ask our students, what did you find engaging? Where did you feel present in that lesson? And so for all of the other speakers and myself, it's beneficial to hear, and of course for Ellii too. And then if any of you would like to keep in touch, there's my contact information. The QR code leads to my LinkedIn. And you may have noticed on the left-hand side here, there's this beautiful Ellii mug, which I believe is going to be raffled off in just a few minutes. But for now, I'll stop my screen share so that Lise can share some of the questions that all of you have had for me as we go through this session.
Yes, thank you, Angela. That was great. I don't even think I need to do any closing remarks now. You did everything for me. That was great. Okay, let's get to some of these questions. We've got some great questions here, and we definitely have time to look at some of them. So I'm just going to share it on the screen and I'll read it out for you, Angela, and then you can give us your response. So here we go. Our first question. How can ESL instructors create classroom discussions that encourage students to share personal experiences and opinions, making language practice more engaging and meaningful?
Sure, that's a great question, and definitely, creating space for students to bring their whole selves or their whole people into our classroom does make a huge difference in how invested and how relevant it is, as well as how well they're able to connect with one another in ways that are authentic. Something that I like to do is I like to kind of set some boundaries and expectations. At our university, we've started some of the norms like introducing ourselves with our pronouns, and we also tell students, you can choose to do that or not if that's not something you want to centralize about your identity. And just reminding people that their identity is valued. I think sometimes for our English language learners, they may feel hesitant to contribute because they have concerns that they'll slow down the discussion or that they haven't fully grasped the content. And so I think one of the most encouraging things that we can do, especially if our learners are going into other contexts with those who are not language learners, is asking them, what do you feel comfortable sharing and where do you feel like you might need an ally? And even asking someone, hey, I have things to say, but I'm struggling. Would you mind making space for me? Or saying, so and so, do you have something to add? Because this is a lot lower risk, and I find that my students respond well to this tip. Like, find a friend, ask them to say, do you want to add something? And not only does it create that space for our learner without them having to make a whole big issue of it, but it also enables the person who's been their ally to model that behavior for others. Like, did you have something you wanted to say? Or it sounds like you started to say something there.
Nice. What a great tip. I would never would have thought to do that, but you're right. Maybe in a setting where you've got lots of students who are, nervous to speak, having that kind of buddy system to support each other, that's a really cool way to do it.
Thanks. Oh, and if I can add one more thing to that, I'm going to drop in the chat this resource that we like. It's called Name Coach, and I think this is a great thing to add to email signatures for students who are at higher ed level or a place where they're using email, because just so everyone can feel familiar with name pronunciation, our names come from somewhere, right? They may reflect our culture, our family, something about our heritage, and so for people to have their name pronounced correctly and a low risk place for other people to practice is super helpful. We find.
Very cool. Definitely agree. And actually, the next question I'm going to put on stage now is kind of a connection to the first one, but getting a little bit more specific. It says, I find it especially difficult to have teenagers share personal experiences. Any special
Yeah,
tips?
sure. And I mean, again, this is such a challenging age. I mean, I think there are challenges at any age in life, but for adolescents, when they're kind of navigating their identity, a great way to do this is to remember that bringing personal things to the classroom or making it relevant doesn't always mean asking questions about that individual. It can be reflecting out on their community. So, for example, one of the Ellii questions I shared was about, art in the community. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the student has to say, "Oh, I do this art. This is what it means to me." They can say, I've observed this art out in my community. The artist may have intended this or that. So again, because we're human beings, all of us have things going on, right? There may be areas of my life where I'm like, sure, I'll tell you whatever you want to know, and others where I'm like, well, And so the same is true for our students. So I would advise always to err on the side of caution, so that we're not digging too deeply, especially into the life of these adolescents who may be feeling vulnerable, but finding ways to bring the context close without digging too deep. I know it's a challenging balance to strike, but I just think my main tip is remember that personal and relevant doesn't always mean about the individual.
I love that. That's great. Excellent. Okay, let's do one or two more. Let's see. How about this next question here? How can we encourage questioning and dialogue about controversial topics and keep students and ourselves from taking offense at alternative perspectives?
Okay,
Mm.
this is a great question and so important. And I feel like I know people are coming from everywhere, but at least the entire US needs to have this conversation. Being able to discuss things rationally, especially when you have a personal investment in one perspective, is really tough. But it is so important and kind of the main point of conversation, right? To understand other perspectives. Because if we gain nothing new, I mean, human connection is one thing, but if we don't gain any new perspective, what has our conversation gotten us, right? There was recently a panel at my institution, and one of the speakers talked about, this engineer, and their task was to build a bridge, and they built the bridge, and the bridge was, successful in that it allowed cars to pass from one edge of the river to the other. And then the anthropologist said, well, but you don't understand anything about who's using this bridge or why or what effect it has on the community or labor. And so, you know, the one person's task was achieved, but we are missing perspective of this other person. And so I think that a very long-winded way to reply to your question is maybe one way that we can make this more comfortable is to create some stems, or some kind of frames, not only for proposing, like I perceived this differently or I interpreted this differently, but also, that's an interesting view. I'll take that into consideration, or I'll give that some more thought. So even if we vehemently disagree, we also need to teach our students, we don't always need to respond to the post, right? Sometimes we are going to find more meaningful ways to invest, or we can like look into some negotiation language. Like, I understand that this is your concern. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to try to address some of those specific issues. So, in a lot of ways, communication, this tool that we all work with as language teachers, is the key to answering this question. And some of the specific tools we can use are frameworks and um, setting expectations and creating banks of language that students can use to kind of set up that conflict resolution.
Excellent. That's great. And just like the question asking about how we can think of this for ourselves too, I think that's great advice that we can all take, right? Fantastic. Excellent. Okay, I'm going to have to stop our Q&A there. It is time to wrap up this session and do our draw. But don't forget that Angela is going to be at our presenter table for the next 15 minutes. So you can always go there and talk to her. I encourage you to do that. And it will be our last meet and mingle session of the conference. So please grab a seat at any one of the tables and try to talk to someone new. Okay, let's do our draw. So Angela, do you want to just show us again what yes, the mug.
Beautiful
Beautiful
mug.
Ellii mug. All right, so let's take a look here and see who our winner is. I'm going to show the name on screen. And Angela, if you could read that out for us.
Sure. The winner of this guest speaker session is Matthew L. from Canada. Congratulations, Matthew.
Woo! Congratulations. We will be in contact with you very soon and we'll organize your prize. Excellent. Okay, everyone. Fantastic. There's, like I said, 15 minutes left. You can still rack up some points on that leaderboard. If you're close to the top, I really recommend you try to do that, because we are going to be announcing our top 3 winners at the very end of the day in our final wrap-up session. Remember, those awards are 3-month, 6-month, and a 1-year subscription to Ellii. Still time to join in the conversation on social media using our hashtag ElliiCon2023 and tagging us in the post, and also time to complete that event attendee survey. So get to those while you still can. Okay, everyone, we're going to head to the social lounge, grab a seat at those tables. You have 15 minutes, and then we're going to be all brought back here for our final wrap-up session of the conference, led by Ellie's CEO and founder, Ben Buchwald. So we'll see you back here in 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone. And thank you so much, Angela, for that great presentation.
Oh, thank you for having me and for creating this great space for us all to have the conversation together.
Excellent. Bye-bye. Ellii.